Hey, Kenzie.
Hi, Councillor Flynn.
How are you doing?
Calling this meeting of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. My name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the chair of the committee. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, Verizon Channel 1964. Our council budget review process will encompass about 27 hearings over roughly 6 weeks. We're somewhere in the middle right now. And we strongly encourage residents to take a moment to engage in this process by giving testimony for the record. So you can do that in one of a number of ways. One is to come to a hearing like this virtually on Zoom. You can find the Zoom link on the public notice or get it from council staff. And we'll ask you to wait in the waiting room. I see you've got a number of people right now. And then we'll take testimony at the end of the hearing. Ask folks to stick to 2 to 3 minutes and identify yourself at the beginning. You can also come to one of our 2 remaining dedicated public testimony hearings. So on May 26th at 6 p.m., we have one for BPS. May 28th at 6 p.m., we have one focused on the rest of the city departments. Or if none of those times are convenient to you, you can go on boston.gov/council-FY21Budget and submit a video or submit written testimony that way. You can also email ccc.wm, that's ccc.wm as in mother, at boston.gov. And send us written testimony that way. And if you send it to us, written or spoken testimony in any language, we'll commit to getting it translated for the whole council. You can also tweet us informally at #BossBudget, BOS budget, and we'll try to get those questions answered. So today's hearing is on Dockets 0588 to 0590, orders for the FY21 operating budget, including annual appropriation for departmental operations, for the school department, and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0591 to 0592, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations, and docket 0593 to 0596, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. Those collectively make up the dockets that comprise the mayor's proposed FY21 budget, which is what the council is currently scrutinizing. Our focus area today, however, will be the Landmarks Commission, which is a commission that is within the Environment Department of the city. So we'll be hearing today from Chris Cook, Chief of Energy, Environment, and Open Space, Carl Spector, the Commissioner of the Environment Department, and Roseanne Foliot, the Director of Historic Preservation for the city. I want to thank them all. We started this morning with a hearing on the other aspects of the Environment Department. We've really pulled landmarks out this afternoon for some dedicated focus because I think, it's a really important function of our city and we don't want it to get lost in the shuffle. So without further ado, I'll go to Chief Cook and his team.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and I know you have a full slate, so I will defer to Commissioner Spector for opening statements.
All right, Commissioner Spector, you're muted.
Here we go, sorry. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you the Environment Department's responsibilities in historic preservation. As we discussed during this morning's hearing, the Environment Department leads the city's work in climate action, historic preservation, energy management, and much more. Our historic preservation responsibilities fall into 3 categories. First is our support of the Landmarks Commission and its 9 associated neighborhood commissions. Collectively, the historic commissions review about 1,300 applications every year and over 100 public hearings. The 92 members of these commissions represent an extraordinary amount of dedication and commitment to the continuity and vitality of Boston. The time and effort that they volunteer in service to Boston is a great gift to our community. Applications to the commissions include requests for design review and approval, as well as for demolition. The Landmarks Commission is also an arbiter of whether a structure is historically significant and therefore eligible for a grant under the Community Preservation Act. The historic preservation staff work with applicants to help them understand historic preservation guidelines and complete applications. They organize hearings and they inspect sites when necessary to ensure compliance with historic preservation requirements. In respect to hearings, the historic preservation team has done great work in moving these online. At this point, most of our commissions have had at least 1 hearing online. As you know, historic preservation hearings can attract a great deal of interest. It has been a major goal of the staff and the commissions to enable virtual hearings to permit as much public input as in-person hearings, just as you were doing here. The second set of activities concerns planning. Historic preservation staff provide input to the Boston Planning and Development Agency and other departments in the development of neighborhood plans. In the past few years, primarily with the support of grants from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, we've also been expanding our knowledge and documentation of historic resources in Boston, particularly in Roxbury. Another important planning activity has been strengthening the connections between historic preservation and climate action, which we discussed a little bit this morning. 2 years ago, for example, we released the Resilient Historic Buildings Design Guide to assist owners of historic properties in meeting the city's goals in climate adaptation. Our climate and preservation teams are now working together to determine how the concept of embodied carbon, that is the emissions represented by the materials and construction of buildings, fits into the city's carbon reduction and preservation goals. In the third category is our archaeology program, located in the city's Rivermore building near Millennium Park. We're now working with our colleagues in public facilities and property management to determine how modifications planned for that building will affect the archaeology lab. The past several years have seen an active schedule of summer archaeological digs across the city, in the North End, Roxbury, Chinatown, but for obvious reasons, this is likely to be curtailed this year. The addition in FY20 to the staff of an archaeology lab manager has allowed us to build up the resources to expand the documentation and accessibility of our collections. Grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Community Preservation Committee are enabling us to properly claim, identify, catalog, and photograph thousands of artifacts stored in our collection. This will enable residents, students, and scholars to view, study, and more fully understand all aspects of the history of Boston. I'm pleased to tell you that despite the pressures on the FY21 budget, the mayor's proposal continues his strong support of our work in historic preservation. In this area, our goals for FY21, in addition to the projects already mentioned, include expansion of public access to historic commission hearings through online platforms, building on the lessons of the past 2 months, reduction of the backlog of pending landmarks, and completion of draft guidelines for the proposed Highland Park Architectural Conservation District in Roxbury. Thank you. We're happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Spector. All right, I want to recognize my colleagues who have joined. So we're joined today, in addition to myself, from District 8 by Councillor Liz Breeden from District 9, Councillor Ed Flynn from District 2, Councillor Michael Flaherty at large, Councillor Andrea Campbell, District 4, Councillor Lydia Edwards, District 1, and Councillor Anissa Savi-George, also at large. And also by Councillor Mejia at large. So we'll jump into questions. I think, I'll just say, I'll defer my questions again after my colleagues. But as I said at the start, really wanted to have this focus because I think it, everything gets done based on how we, focus and attend to it. And that's a question of money, and it's also a question of time. And so really wanted to give this important priority today, our time collectively as a council. So now I'll go first off to Councillor Breeden. Councillor Breeden, you're muted.
Councillor Bach, can you skip to the next person?
I can skip to the next person. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bach, and thank you to the chief and to the commissioner as well. I was at a Fort Point Neighborhood Association meeting on Zoom last week, and one of the questions that was discussed, as you know, the Fort Point is a historic landmark district. Residents worked tirelessly with stakeholders and the city to receive the designation in 2009. So we're proud of this designation. Since 2016, they've experienced vacancies on the Fort Point Channel Landmark District Commission. As a result, there have been occasions when a meeting had to be canceled due to a lack of a quorum. These vacancies can put a heavy burden on our current commissioners for sure. Over the past few years, Fort Point Neighborhood Association, along with others, approved Fort Point organizations have submitted candidates to fill 2 neighborhood representative vacancies. So how can can the residents work with you, the commissioners, to make sure they're seated so that we can support the important work that they are doing at the Fort Point Channel landmarks? Any thoughts about that, or how we can help out the neighborhood?
Sure, Counselor, I'm happy to let the commissioner speak to the process of vacancies, but in general, we should say that we should prioritize that. I mean, it's absolutely upsetting not only to constituents but to project proponents when they can't get heard at a hearing because of vacancies, and it should be unacceptable. And so I'm happy to prioritize it and working going forward. Commissioner can talk about some of the processes and complexities around it. Just very briefly, just because you mentioned Fort Point, though, I think that is the perfect example of where climate adaptation and climate mitigation efforts meet historic preservation. When you look at a community that's vulnerable to sea level rise, I mean, this is exactly why Environment America worked with Historic Places of America to sign an amicus brief against the Trump administration against their some of the rule promulgation from the EPA, because the effects of climate change are putting our historical places more at risk, and nowhere is that more clear than someplace like Fort Point. Carl?
Yeah, thank you, Councilor, for your question, and we definitely recognize that the delay in getting new commissioners appointed has been a problem, not just in Fort Point, but in several other of the district commissions. We know we need to do better, and we are working very hard to work out that the whole process. Each district commission has a slightly different process in terms of where we get nominations from neighborhood organizations, or the nominations come from the mayor, and then coordinating that with the city council itself. Some commissions need approval by the city council, some don't. And we are working very hard to make that as streamlined and as efficient and as clear as possible. And we're delighted to work with you and with the constituents in all the districts to get that moving ahead as smoothly as possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councilor Barr. That's all I have. Again, want to say thank you to the mayor's team that is with us today for their outstanding work. On behalf of the residents of Boston, you're doing a great job, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Next up is Councillor Breeden. Orders in the chat. Councillor Breeden.
Thank you, Councillor Bach, for accommodating me. One question I had was really with regard to demolition delay. Very often there's a building of historic significance or questions about historical significance, and we only get like a 90-day delay for demolition. And very often this happens at the sort of the 11th hour, and it takes community advocates have to scramble to try and preserve a structure. Is there any way we can work to increase the demolition delay from maybe up to a year, just to give us more time to preserve some structures that are getting demolished in our neighborhoods?
So thank you, Councillor. We recognize that there are many areas of dissatisfaction with the way that process works, and we have been having discussions both internally and with external stakeholders, both preservationists and neighborhood groups and developers, about what an alternative method might be, about whether there should be a change in the delay period, as you suggest. And so there's an active discussion about that, and we're happy to continue to talk about it and determine whether a new proposal is necessary. Right now, the demolition delay is a provision of the zoning code, so it is under the purview of the BPDA, but we have also engaged them in this discussion. And so it's ongoing, and we welcome your participation in that.
Thank you. And just a broader conversation about areas of our neighbourhoods that are historic in terms of architectural interest and just the general streetscapes. It's the zoning board purview. So I really look forward to working with you folks and seeing if we can come to a common agreement across from the historic Landmarks Commission and the BPDA to try and get some clarity on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Breeden. Councillor Campbell? Councillor Campbell? You there? All right, we're going to skip Councillor Campbell for a moment. We will go to Councillor Edwards. Councillor Edwards, folks, I need people to be ready. All right, Councillor Asabi George, go ahead.
No, I'm ready. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
No worries. Okay, Councillor Edwards, then it'll be Councillor Asabi George. Go ahead, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to discuss the Landmarks Commission's, again, the budget, that it needs to be the front-facing institution that I think it could increase and should be. I've found most of the conversations I have about the Landmarks Commission has to do with development. And usually it's coming in after the fact and usually with an attempt to try and stop it. I personally think, I don't want necessarily that to be the role of the Landmarks Commission, but I do want it to be open to people coming to, asking about and proposing ideas. For example, there was a thing about the Nazaro Center that was well in advance. I thought that was a good conversation. They brought that before the Landmarks Commission. So how can we make this, again, a place where people can apply for, have an online portal, get to the Landmarks Commission before they're trying to oppose something? You know, I had folks thinking about the North End in general as a city, you know, but how do we do that? And most importantly, what is the infrastructure you need to support that kind of front-facing, suggestions receiving entity? Again, too many times people come to my office and probably maybe even to you guys trying to stop something. And the other thing that we wanted to do is to work with you to map out historic treasures that hadn't been mapped out before. I remember we were discussing that, I can't remember with who, but it seemed like such a wonderful way to engage the community about what we want to save, what we think is beautiful, before we're in the middle of a development battle. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Yeah, so thank you, Councillor. So, you know, we certainly are engaged in trying to spread the word so that people are aware not just of the commission and the historic preservation staff in the Environment Department, but of the value of historic preservation and how it works in the city of Boston and what it gives to the city of Boston. I'll let Roseanne Foliot, our Director of Historic Preservation, talk in a minute about the efforts that she has made to expand outreach and, you know, and our visibility. But you know, we are, when things happen at the last minute, we're not any happier than anyone else. When it happens at the last minute, obviously it puts enormous stress on our ability, just in terms of our ability to get work done, but the type of conversation and the type of discussion that we want to have around historic preservation is difficult to have in that framework. So we've been engaged more in, you know, talking early on with our colleagues in other departments, particularly with the BPDA, about getting involved in their planning efforts so that historic preservation concerns are expressed early on, and then to enhancing communication about what projects are coming to us and what projects are coming to the BPDA, enhancing communication between our staffs so that we can make sure that historic preservation concerns are raised as early as possible. Roseanne, would you like to talk some about your efforts in that regard?
Sure. You mean about outreach or?
Both outreach and in terms of your coordination with the BPDA and other planning efforts.
Sure. And someone took my video off. I don't know if it's what the reason is for that, but anyway, I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
We do have an actual public out. There we go. Thank you. We do have an outreach coordinator on our team who manages our social media and a regular newsletter. So, Counselor, I think it would be great for more and more people to learn about what we're doing and participate in activities and ask questions.
If I may, just before I know my time is going to be up, some suggestions about not just reaching out to us, but how are we building an infrastructure for the community to reach to you? If someone comes to me and says, hey, I got a great idea, I want Day Square in East Boston to be historic preservation, I would like to be able to say, go to blank link or blank website, fill this out, you will be connected with somebody, and they will walk you through that process, whether it's petition gathering or so on and so forth. And so that's what I guess, because I feel like people are going to come anyway. I agree with Commissioner Spector. We want them to come way before a development idea is out there. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're working to build an infrastructure. And if you needed more money for that, I wanted to know about that. Sorry to cut you off, Roseanne. I didn't mean to if I cut you off.
Yeah, no problem. blc@boston.gov gets anyone in touch with half of the team. Our website is boston.gov/landmarks, and I think it's pretty full of all kinds of information.
Thank you. And I know the gavel's coming, it's up. Just to make sure, again, because we have beautiful histories of all different languages and different ethnicities, if we can have maybe that form or some sort of outreach that is multilingual. We have, I think we just did little Saigon. So there's different beautiful things coming about. And so I wanted to make sure that we also had that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Yeah, let me just say that, we are in the process of working to get all the basic historic preservation forms and guidelines translated into the major languages of Boston, so it can have just that sort of accessibility that you recommend, Councillor. Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. Next up, Councillor Isabi George, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia. Councillor Isabi George.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone who's back on this hearing, and special thanks to Roseanne for her work, and see her in the building quite a bit and just works tirelessly on behalf of the residents in the city of Boston, doing her work. Although, I've tried to keep a lot of my questions sort of separate from the pandemic and our city's response to COVID-19, because I do think that as much as we have to do that work, we have to continue the city's business. But I do wonder the impact that the state of emergency has had on your efforts. And my understanding is that the department's only accepting design review applications with a signed extension form. So I'm just wondering, how many applications have been submitted so far? How much of a delay has that created? And what's, just sort of that wait list, what's the wait list potential and probability and impact on our work, or on your work?
So thank you, Councillor. I'll let Roseanne add anything she needs to about numbers, but the historic preservation staff has done great work to get virtually all of the commission hearings running virtually, so that we can keep up with the flow of work and keep our normal operations as close to normal as possible. So things are flowing. I know early on, a month ago, some of the commission hearings did get canceled. And we were, as you said, asking people to sign a form saying that they were accepting a slower process, but I think we're pretty close to eliminating the backlog. Roseanne, could you comment on that?
Yes, we're at the point where we're pretty much dealing with the backlog, especially in the South End. We had 3 hearings this month to catch up with the backlog. We have also allowed people to email their applications in addition to hard copies, since we're not in the office. So the pace has not let up. We're still getting as many applications as we ever did. And we're, everyone on our team is fantastic at working really hard to get everything.
That's great. That's great to hear. Thank you, Roseanne, for that. And happy to hear that work continues at a very healthy and productive pace. With the 9 commissions that we have there been requests for additional districts across our city, historic districts? And what's that process look like should a community want to apply for that? And then my last question is, because I'm sure to get the gavel shortly, the work of the community preservation efforts have been underway, and we just recently passed a multi-million-dollar package to support some efforts across our city. Where along that process does the Landmarks Commission get looped in, so that you're sort of there? I'd like to know that you're there closer to the beginning of those efforts. So additional districts under consideration, or what that process might look like should somebody be interested in it, and then your role in the CPA process. Thank you.
Well, why don't I start, and then Roseanne can jump in too. So first of all, and I believe that there are 6 pending petitions for landmark districts, one of which is in active development now, and that is the Highland Park, where there is a study development. We are working on a study report, and a committee has been formed to propose guidelines for that. There is a several-step process, and I believe we have guidelines on the application and the guidelines for on the website for how to do that. There has to be some preliminary research and a petition to the Landmarks Commission. If that initial petition is accepted, then we will, at some point when we have the resources and when we're working through the queue, commission a more detailed study report, and there's a formation of a committee that develops guidelines and completes the definition of the district. That go back to the Landmarks Commission for approval. If it's approved by the Landmarks Commission, then it goes both to the mayor and to the city council. So it is an involved process, but it's also a big step for a neighborhood. So it has to be thorough. With the CPA, so first I want to say, I know many of you work to support passage of the CPA, so thank you very much. And we think it's doing it's a great boost to the historic preservation activities in the city, and has created even more interest, I think, in historic preservation in the city. We've been involved with the Community Preservation Committee from the start. One of the members of the Community Preservation Committee, by law, is a member of the Landmarks Commission. And actually the current chair of the Community Preservation Commission is that Landmarks representative. The CPA, Landmarks can designate a property that's not already been designated as historically significant, as being historically significant so that it can be eligible for funding. And we invite any property that does receive funding that is not already subject to Landmark's jurisdiction to come to an advisory hearing and get the Landmarks Commission's guidance and advice on doing that in an appropriate way. Roseanne, would you like to add to that?
So for CPA, you're absolutely right. We have 3 different ways that we're involved. We're glad to see that CPA now has historic preservation staff to help move those projects along. For the districts, we get asked that all the time. We do have the pending districts. The North End is a pending district from decades ago. I talk to anyone and everyone who's interested in the designation process about how it works and the petitions needed and so forth. So I'm glad to talk to anybody.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know the buzzer's about to go off. Thank you.
It is indeed. Thank you so much, Councillor Savi George. Okay, next up is Councillor Mejia, and then it'll be Councillor O'Malley, and then Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Mejia.
Good afternoon. I'm so excited to still be here with you all. Thank you for all your hard work again, and thank you, Councillor Chairwoman Bach. So I'm just curious. I know we already talked about outreach and engagement in communities who have been traditionally just engaged with issues of landmark and all that good stuff. You know, I have the it's both a curse and a blessing at the same time. But you know, I'm still learning my way through all of these different departments and the work that the city does. And I'm just curious in terms of just general outreach and communication around the landmarks process and the whole way that the way you work. Has there ever been, or could there ever be just a communications campaign that helps people understand what it is that you all do? What is the role of the community in this process? Just really layman's terms, just because I feel like oftentimes we have this expectation that people know what the Landmark Commission does and how it works, and the fact that you can identify some spaces to deem as historic. Like, I'm just curious about that process, and if there is already a video or already a campaign, if you could just point me to those materials so that I can share with our networks, that would be really helpful. And if there isn't, I believe that Councillor Edwards' previous point in terms of engagement, I think just the bare minimum of what it is and how it works would be really, really helpful to a lot of folks who may not be so duper engaged as you all are in these conversations.
Councillor, thank you very much for your question. I'm going to obviously let Carl and Roseanne speak to it as they're the experts, but because your question gives me the opportunity, I just want to highlight the amazing efforts of the Boston Preservation Alliance, Alison Frazee, Greg Gayler, and the entire staff. That is core to their mission, reaching out to communities that aren't just represented in our historical districts. And so we really have to commend them as community partners for those efforts. And there is a sense that there's a vulnerability there, that if a community is not fully engaged around the benefits of preservation, that we could actually lose some of that building stock that is so central to that neighborhood's identity. So I do want to give the Preservation Alliance kudos for being intentional around that work. Carl and Roseanne?
Yeah, and we certainly have increased our various types of outreach activities. In the past couple of years, Roseanne and her team have started up a historic preservation newsletter, which is certainly only one of the many ways that we need to get at information. We have a more robust website for people who reach us that way. We welcome the opportunity to talk with any group, and your idea of a more general outreach or education campaign is certainly one that we can think about.
Yeah, that would be extremely helpful. I know I would benefit from watching that video. As someone now who's in City Hall, I have a responsibility to know all of these things, but if you all can help me better understand the work that you do, then I could be of service in helping other people understand why it's so important for us to preserve some of these historical places. And also, how do we identify what is deemed as historical? I don't want to make assumptions, but I'm sure there's like some prerequisite of what that looks like, and I think we can all benefit from some, or at least I'll speak for myself. On the council, I know that I can benefit, and I don't want this to be about me, but I'm thinking about the people who follow the work that we do from our office. I think that the community at large would definitely benefit from understanding.
You know, in the past several decades, there's been a very wonderful expansion of the understanding what historic preservation is. And, you know, it is certainly not the case here in Boston, and it's certainly not the case within the Landmarks Commission and the Historic Preservation staff. It's certainly not our expectation that historical means, you know, the Puritan settlers and the Revolution. That there's a much deeper and much broader understanding of what historic means, and that we certainly stress the importance of understanding all aspects of Boston history. You know, all the communities that were involved. You know, the people who worked, the people who were here willingly or not. You know, and you know, groups that were, you know, who've been neglected sometimes in our history, and certainly and especially through our archaeology program, making sure there's a clear understanding of the people who were here before the Europeans were.
And I have
making sure that is also a part of the historic preservation.
And I have one more question before Councilor Bach puts that gavel down. Is that I'm just curious about: is there in terms of development, is there a certain guideline where we say that developers can't build? Because I know in Dorchester, by the Meeting House, I think it's around there, there's a building that was supposed to be historic, but there was some question about when the deed was written. Is there any way for us to, is there a place for us to look for a criteria of how we prevent developers from taking historic locations and building on them?
Yeah, Roseanne, could you address that?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a combination of the Article 85 process, which is for demolition. We check for significance, and then if a building is significant, there's a 90-day delay. But there's also a map of historical resources, and I can, in Boston, and I can share that with all the counselors, because I think it's great that you're asking the questions and want to know, so happy to share.
Thank you. Okay, I yield the rest of my time, Councilor Bach. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. So thank you all for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. All right, Councilor O'Malley, and then it'll be Councilor Flaherty and Councilor Campbell. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I came in a little bit late. Just to be clear, we're doing landmarks, and I know Joe Bagley's on. Are we doing archives as well this round?
We are. I mean, this is landmarks. We don't have a separate one for archives and archaeology. So Joe's here, so I would say feel free to take advantage.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you for all your great work. I'm delighted to have the special focus on landmarks and just know what an important role it serves and how acutely we're reminded of how important it is as it relates to preservation being part of planning, and obviously goes without saying, remembering our history. You know, it seems that every couple months we hear about a beloved Boston landmark slated for closure. We felt it acutely in District 6 with Doyle's Cafe closure in September, announcement of closure in September. Just last week, Great Scott in Alston and Councilor Braid's district, top of the hub, Bergen Park, the list goes on. And I think sometimes it can be frustrating that we're not able to sort of leverage some resources because many of these buildings or businesses don't necessarily reach the high threshold of landmark designation. So my first question is, Roseanne, can you talk a little bit about well, I guess I'll start with a question. How many petitions for landmarks designation did your department receive this year?
This calendar year, we've received, I think it's 5. Off the top of my head, right? But we have over 80 pending petitions as well. And we were in discussions for quite a while with the Doyles folks. And yes, we do have an issue with locally significant not meeting the standard of our state enabling legislation. So it's we're always trying to help people get that significance level as high as possible.
So how would we change that? Because I think that's sort of the crux of my line of questioning this is that, you know, preservation planning is key to development, and it's also key to the uniqueness and the fabric of a city like Boston, particularly, perhaps more than most other cities in the country. So there are certain areas that would, I think most people agree, have earned, or most people would agree, there are certain businesses and buildings that would have earned a designation of landmark status, yet don't reach the threshold. So how could we amend that going forward? Can the city theoretically create its own landmarks designation that would then possibly allow for funding and support and opportunities to preserve and protect?
So we're up against our state law, right? Our enabling legislation has actual language in it that says to designate a landmark, it must be of significance to the city and the Commonwealth. If we can somehow find a way to modify that one errant and make it a comma, that would allow our commission a lot more flexibility in designating locally significant.
Are you aware of any other cities that sort of have that? And this may turn out to a separate hearing order that I may file, you know, post budget hearings. But do you know of any local cities that sort of have that unique position, or are in the unique position that Boston's in, that are able to designate things as locally historically significant?
We've been trying to collect that information, Counselor, and I think the fact that we're early, 1975, means that we were, people were trying to make sure that the significance level was always the most important buildings, and we've definitely learned a lot since that time.
Okay.
But we're trying to collect a database about other cities.
Okay, great. We'll follow up offline, because I think there's a nugget of an interesting idea there that would both help our historic preservation and protect the neighborhood character. So you said there were 5 petitions for landmark designations filed with you approximately, and then about 80 that are sort of in flux, meaning they've begun the process and there could be some meat there. And is that higher than the previous year, or is that on par?
Well, we're whittling away at the pending landmarks, but of course, then we always get new
ones. I guess, are you seeing as sort of, and this may be a moot point, as sort of the economy, we re-enter an economy which likely won't be as strong of a full real estate market, but have you noticed an uptick as Boston's real estate market has gotten so much hotter and more development is happening, that an increase in I assume the answer is yes.
In petitions?
Yeah. And do you feel that you have the proper bandwidth in your department to address those and to be able to sort of expedite the due diligence that each one requires?
We will, as soon as we hire our new staff architect. We've had a vacancy for a bit, so we're working on that right now.
Great. And is that architect position contingent upon the passage of this bill in the new fiscal year, or is it just we haven't found the right person?
It's a matter of the search, in, the development world meant not a lot of architects were looking for jobs, and now suddenly they are.
Good. And do you know offhand, this may be you, this may be ISD, the number of demolition applications that have been filed?
We have a pretty steady rate of each year of about 140 to 150. Sometimes it seems they come in batches, which is overwhelming.
Yeah.
But it hasn't let up.
Okay. Well, that again, I for one think that anything we can do to sort of help support you and your department to bolster the ranks of your team to be able to address these and work with neighbors is absolutely crucial. Similarly, and I know the gavel is up, but Joe Bagley, my neighbor, I'm proud to represent the City Archives in West Roxbury. I know that you have, I think it was last year's budget, you were able to get additional staffing, a laboratory manager. And that position's been filled, right, Joe?
Well, let me answer for Joe. I don't think he's on, but yes, that position has been filled.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, these are two absolutely crucial sort of sub-departments within, environment, and we want to make sure that they're used well, and also have an opportunity to both protect our history and protect the character of the neighborhood. So I look forward to continuing to work with you. I always ask this question, so we'll try to sneak it in, even though my time's up. Favorite building in the city of Boston? Roseanne, Carl, Chris?
For me, it's going to be Boston City Hall.
City Hall. Good choice. Carl?
My own house, thank you very much.
All right, fair enough. Chris?
I'm in it. It's the Parkman House.
Parkman House. I'd go with the Custom House, but good answers all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you, Councillor O'Malley. Just before I recognize Councillor Flaherty, I just want to read into the record. I did receive a letter from Council President Janey, who wrote to Chairwoman Bach, due to another commitment, I will be unable to attend today's budget hearing on landmarks. I'm grateful for the work the Landmarks Commission does to preserve Boston's rich history, and I look forward to reviewing the tape. Please read this letter into the public record. Thank you. And that was sincerely Kim Janey, Boston City Council President, District 7. So just wanted to record her regrets at not being able to be here with us. And now, Councillor Flaherty, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and obviously thanks to the Commissioner and thanks to Roseanne for the work that you guys are doing on behalf of the city. As Chair of the City Council's Committee on CPA, I'd like to thank you guys for your continued efforts to support the work of the CPC, particularly in the area of affordable housing, open space, and historic projects. And it's kind of on the same lines as the previous two speakers. I know that as our city continues to grow and change rapidly, I get calls, regularly for folks looking at sort of some local landmarks. I guess they're not technically landmarks, but they view them as landmarks. A lot of special mainstays within each of our neighborhoods, and they're fearful that they're going to fall victim to development or overdevelopment in a particular community, and they would love for that beautiful edifice to be landmarked. So, can you maybe just speak a little bit about that process and whether or not this budget? I think you hear from folks, all the previous speakers support the work that you're doing, and our constituents obviously love the work that you guys do. They wish you were able to do more. But how does this budget support those efforts and particularly the outreach efforts to our residents so that they better understand how the Landmarks Commission works, how they can better interact with the Landmarks Commission? I think folks just think they got to run around and get signatures and then it's off to the races. And I think it's a little bit more involved in that. But does this operating budget allow you, your team, Commish, to be competitive, with particularly smaller jobs in the private sector as well?
Well, thank you, Councillor. So Roseanne indicated a crucial thing that we need to do to fill the open position that is in it. There's a very hard-working team, and they've done a great job of not only dealing with COVID and the stresses from that, but with an open position, because it is a small team, any vacancies does put a strain on their work. But they've done a great job, and I know we're all looking forward to filling that position in the next few months. And as Roseanne indicated, once that position is filled and she has a full complement, we will be able to have a much more, be able to expand, more of what we're doing and the type of outreach that sometimes gets, curtailed when we're just trying to keep the, the flow of review and other absolutely necessary processes going. So, we appreciate your support, and we've seen some expansion in the historic preservation team the past few years. As Councilor O'Malley mentioned, we have a new staff person with the archaeology team. A couple years before that, we did get another staff person for the historic preservation team, to work on with the commissions, and that has helped a lot. So we certainly have a lot of work to do, but we're getting it done, and we appreciate the support we get from the council.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioner. And again, thanks to the team, your team, Roseanne and others that do a lot of work here. And I know you get pulled in a lot of different directions. You get asked all the time. So anything we can do to support Landmark's efforts. I know you guys play also a big role with the curb cuts. At least you have a voice with respect to some of those things happen. And those are also other issues that occur in the Public Improvement Commission, but sometimes overlap and involve and get secure your input as well. So again, you're moving in many different directions, and I know that it's an important facet of our city, particularly around the development circles. And when you have that sort of that jewel, that special gem, that structure that's in your community, and you just want you want to hold on to it, you want to protect it, you want to preserve it, and that always becomes a dilemma when you have development and in some instances overdevelopment in our community. So appreciate the work you do, and happy to support this portion of the budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Next up, Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Councillor Bach, and my apologies, some technical difficulties over here, and I was hoping that if I shut out my video that they would go away, but they have not. So thank you again to everyone for participating in this hearing. I've already thanked the commissioner and everyone else, but Roseanne, I want to specifically, of course, thank you for your incredible work. I obviously represent Dorchester, Mattapan, my biggest neighborhoods, and I know that you are a fighter when it comes to the work you do, especially with respect to some of our Dorchester constituents. So on behalf of my constituents, wanted to just personally thank you for getting in the weeds on some cases too, and going out on a limb to really preserve, frankly, landmarks in our city, and particularly those that often get overlooked because of the size and scale. I won't ask this question. I think it's come up quite a bit from other colleagues, as well as from the advocacy from residents and folks within organizations around the capacity of staffing, salaries, and fully support giving you guys the resources you need. Councilor Flaherty just spoke to the CPA in particular, how important that work is. Was really happy to work with him on that. So I won't speak to all of that. I think everyone echoes, give you the money you need. But one specific question I had, and if this came up, I apologize if I missed it, I might have been disconnected, is just the backlog of landmark properties in need of further study. And if it did, Councilor Bach, just say it did.
No, I mean, it's come up, but I think it's still fair to ask about, Councilor.
Okay, awesome. Don't want to duplicate efforts. That was my only question in this desire to have more proactive efforts around education and outreach. And if you're wondering who that is, that's my baby Aiden jumping in his bouncer and saying hello. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. So, we are trying to, as Roseanne said, whittle away at the number of pending landmarks that we have. That list is much longer than we would like it to be. We are right now launching an effort to at least several more. Roseanne, could you speak to where we are in that process?
Right. We have a contract that is poised to pay a consultant to help us with approximately a half dozen study reports, which are the requirement for getting a petition through to designation. And in general, I mean, it costs between $5,000 and $10,000 per study report. And those are required by our enabling legislation, again, in order to go through the petition and designation process.
Roseanne and the Landmarks Commission actually the past year have done a great job of working to streamline the process so that we're sure we're getting the information that we require, but we're not asking for more than we need. So, and this should help us to, again, make the process faster and help us to address that backlog.
Thank you guys so much. And Carl, thank you. Commissioner Cook, thank you. Roseanne, thank you. I'll see you guys in the subsequent hearing, and consider me a partner in the work. And Roseanne, thank you again for the work you do on the constituent case side. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Councilor.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Before I launch my questions, I just want to say to folks that I'm not planning on doing a full second round. So if somebody has a burning question, they should raise their blue hand. Otherwise, after I finish my questions, we'll go to public testimony because I'm mindful of our parks hearing coming up with some of the same folks. So with that, I'll start my questions. You know, and I guess I want to preface it by saying I think the Landmarks Commission does amazing work, and everybody here does incredible work on historic preservation. And so if there's a tone of frustration in some of my questions, it's not directed at any of the fantastic professionals here. I come from a place of thinking that Boston is the most historic city in the country, and that we do not resource our historic preservation in a way commensurate with that. So to that point, it doesn't really sound to me from the answer so far like we have a plan to clear the backlog, because if we're getting about 5 petitions a year and we're maybe going to handle a half dozen this year, I mean, I guess that's a slightly better rate than replacement. So, you know, in principle, maybe in 100 years we would get it solved. But I just, and you know, some of that's money. And I think you just referenced, Roseanne, maybe what it looks like to clear our backlog back to, you know, back that 83 is $800,000. But I want to understand, it didn't seem like from the answer to the question I asked in the working session, like we have a plan to clear the backlog. Like that doesn't seem like it's a trackable, achievable goal on the current trajectory we're on. I mean, is that fair?
Well, there's it's a resource constraint issue, Counselor, and you know, we, under the current circumstances, we are using the resources that we have as effectively as we can to address that. It is something that I keep in mind. You know, when we typically when we get to the towards the end of the year, and since I've been commissioner and I see that some other effort where we've allocated money, it may not have spent the money that we've allocated for it. I try to get Roseanne and say, okay, let's try to get some study reports done. But that is the situation that we're in. Obviously, with the stresses under the current budget, we're just going to have to do the best we can.
Roseanne, it may be helpful to talk about how you prioritize different studies.
So every year we have a work plan that the commission votes on, and they prioritize the different landmarks, small L, I guess you'd say, that need to have petitions, and we try to look into those. And then they also prioritize the pending petitions to elevate the ones that might have a higher threat. So every year we do prioritize, and then we try to whittle away using that priority list. But it can be slow going.
In my written, oh, sorry, I was muted. I raise it because I appreciate you responded to my written questions also with a note that you did to Councillor O'Malley about the possibility of if we could change that and to a comma, we could recognize more of the types of landmarks that our communities know and treasure. And I think that's such an important change to make. I mean, I think the historic preservation community, and Commissioner Spector referenced this, has really come to understand the way in which historic preservation is about a whole fabric, and it's not just, you know, the buildings. Again, with no offense to the Copley painting behind the chief, it's not all about buildings where Paul Revere slept and broke bread. But my fear is, say we were incredibly successful at changing that enabling legislation. What we would do is we would then create a massive additional backlog of landmarks, right? Because you would suddenly make it easier for people to bring successful petitions for local landmarks. So it just seems to me like this, we can't, again, I said this on the climate thing, right? You can't get there from here. Like, there's the throughput that we have for processing these petitions. It's not adequate to the situation we have right now. And it's also not adequate to the situation we would like to be in, where we were more able to recognize the historic resources across our communities. So I want to raise that as a problem, and one that probably has to be addressed both by resources and by a certain creativity in how we do our process.
Councilor, I think your point is well met. It is analogous to the new wetlands ordinance in the city of Boston, where the conditions themselves lend themselves to a fresh approach, not only to resource allocation, but also staff time and staff strategic thinking. So thank you.
Thank you. And I guess another question I wanted to ask was, there's a reference to, I mean, I think there's a ton of frustration with the demolition delay process. I hear it also from you all and the commission. And I just wonder if there is the opportunity to change Article 85, like what kinds of changes would really make a difference there? Because right now it strikes me as the worst kind of tool where, I mean, developers regard it as this thing that swoops in at the last minute, and so it frustrates them. But then for the community, you know, developers are starting the clock on it long before we're even having the conversation. It's a very frustrating, and I think often also just gives false hope, which is not something that I think we want to be in the business of in civic community. So I would love to hear a little bit about what the prospects are for thinking through a zoning amendment there, and what the department thinks might make sense on that front.
So without circumventing public process around any rule promulgation that we would normally engage in, I think Commissioner can talk about the major tension points with the existing rule.
So some of the, Councilor, you quite accurately identify the problems that there's a lack of clarity about what the whole process means and about what it can deliver. And so how do we increase the clarity and increase the effectiveness and reduce the frustration? So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, to another question, you know, there's discussion about, do we change the amount of the delay period? But if we do that, and we more effectively clarify what buildings might be subject to it, so that people know much earlier about whether they're going to have to deal with it or not. So that's a lot about communication and education about what we're trying to accomplish. Another aspect of it that has been discussed is during the delay period, however long it is, can we more effectively structure a process so that there's a real communication and real discussion about alternatives to demolition, so that it's not just a matter of, say, someone who wants to demolish the building, well, comes in and, you know, goes through the motions, but doesn't really effectively engage in a conversation. And that could be from the developer side or even from the community side, you know. And we also want to make sure, with all due respect to advocates, that it doesn't just become an excuse for opposing a project that people don't like for other reasons. So there's all that balancing that we want to do. We welcome ideas about how to do this, about what is the appropriate structure for it. There's been some discussion of whether it should remain, again, from people inside and outside of City Hall, the discussion of whether it should be part of the zoning code or something independent of it, and so have a different framework. So all these ideas have been presented to us, and we welcome a conversation with you or any of the counselors, anyone else who wants to engage in it, about how we get the right mix of elements to resolve those problems we described.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, I would very much like to be part of that conversation. I think that moving the conversation earlier up in the process, into kind of a more of a design review space, like that isn't. I just think even the structure of demolition delay, the fact that you're at the point of like demolishing the building and then it's like no stop, it creates that sort of Damocles over the whole process, and then short of having a way to just blow it up, which I hear you on the question of finding a balance and not having it be just a lever to kill a project. I mean, I just think we need to really change the structure to get away from that sense of futility on all sides, and also to help people envision what updating our city life in a way that makes buildings really usable for our current purposes, but also does real preservation would look like. And I think there is actually a dreaming phase of most projects. And I think historic preservation is coming in after the dreaming phase on a lot of things. And that's a problem, right? And so would love to be part of those conversations. I mean, to me, the question of, do we need something independent or is it in zoning? I also think, I do think there's a real question of whether the Landmarks Commission should itself be independent in the way that the Arts Commission is. I mean, I think it has great support from you in the Environment Department, and I don't mean to shortchange that, but I think that just pulling it out even today for a hearing was about making sure that we got a chance to talk about it. And I imagine that if we had had this as one hearing, we might have had like a couple of questions on landmarks buried at the end, but the whole work with the Environment Department is very urgent. And so I wonder, and I won't put people here on the spot because I know I've run past my time, and also that I don't want to put you on the spot right here, but I'd be interested in the openness to sort of re-envisioning our whole structure for supporting this work.
I don't think it puts us on the spot at all, Counselor. You have a great partner in Commissioner Spector and Director Foley.
Well, I look forward to those ongoing conversations. I think, I guess the one other question I just had was just a factual one. I couldn't tell from the budget because it's all rolled up together how many people are dedicated to the work of the Landmarks Commission specifically.
Well, there are 9. There are 9 people, and that includes two staff members in the archaeology team.
Okay, great. And I would also suggest that it seems like the turnover issues that have been referenced and the challenge with filling the architect's role. I mean, I'm a historian, not an economist, but when roles sit vacant for a long time, often there's something about how you're competing in the marketplace salary-wise. And so it strikes me, I think, Roseanne referenced the fact that we may be entering a slightly different economy right now, or I think we all know that we are. But at the same time, I just wonder, have you looked at all at the question of whether the salaries given the competency we're requiring are really in a position to be competitive?
No, I appreciate the question, Counselor. Just so you know, the specific issue that Roseanne brought up, we also had a very similar issue with landscape architects at the Boston Parks and Recreation Department, where we had a lot of positions that were just vacant because of the private sector opportunities that are available. We certainly don't want to take advantage of a crisis, but there may be opportunity for people who may be looking to work with the city.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a short-term fix, that's great. But I think in the long term, we have to think about, this is it's just a question of like, if this is a role as it is that we need real expertise in, we need to, as a city, be willing to pay for that expertise or admit to ourselves that we're not, right? But I would like it not to be the latter. So yeah, well, I just want to say I hope we can continue to work on this. I personally think that the Landmark Commission needs more resources. I think it needs more staff, more salaries. I think we need to re-envision how we get the backlog cleared. I think we got to think a lot about its powers. I do think there's a little bit of an opportunity to think about the 5% administratively that the CPC has, because I think that, you know, that role of proactive planning to help support community groups is an important piece that I would love to not see getting crowded out. But future conversations for us to have. Chief Cook, you're muted.
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, but we look forward to those conversations. The other aspect I wanted to say is I just want to thank the commission themselves and all the other commissioners for the districts. It's an incredible sacrifice that they make to give their own personal time, and certainly led by Lynn Smilage, our chair. So just on behalf of a grateful city, we're very grateful for the commission themselves.
Yes, no, I want to second that. Lynn's fantastic, and I'm lucky to represent several of our local commissions, Beacon Hill and Back Bay, some of the architectural districts out of the Mission Hill Triangle, and at Bay State Road. And then I think just recently got an inquiry from Fenway about how they can join the queue, Roseanne. So a subsequent conversation to be had. All right, I see that I've got one colleague, Councilor Breeden, raising her hand, so I'm going to recognize her for a quick follow-up question, and then we'll go to public testimony. Councilor Breeden.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. It's really more the interest. I think the area of frustration is where the historical preservation butts up against zoning code, and we're under such pressure to develop all available parcels of land and demolish what we would call pretty robust and stable housing. And it intersects also with the loss of green space around older buildings. So it's a big concern, and I think we have to take a very holistic approach in thinking about preservation of green space, preservation of historic structures, and then really critically looking at our zoning code. I think we've had out here in Alston Brighton, we've had a pretty liberal allocation of variances that have impacted on many of our historic buildings and loss of green space in the neighbourhood. So I really encourage a cross-disciplinary and interdepartmental approach to all of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Breeden. And I do also, before we go to public testimony, want to thank, although it wasn't strictly speaking the subject of the hearing, you know, Joe Bagley, the city archaeologist, did come up, and the work of the archives. And I, in my other life, have a PhD in archival history and in history of philosophy, and have spent a lot of time in archives organized by unsung heroes. And so just want to acknowledge the work of the historical work. And I was thrilled to see that work about cataloging some of the stuff that the city's got. So just wanted to make that public shout out as well. All right, we are now going to take public testimony. I've got a number of folks signed up to testify, and then a few others in the waiting room who I will recognize. So first up, sorry, I got to pull up my list here. First up will be Greg Gayler from the Boston Preservation Alliance, and then it'll be Beth Harris. So, and I'll just ask, I will ask everyone before Greg starts, just when you start, make sure to introduce yourself and then limit your remarks to no more than 3 minutes. Thanks so much. Greg Gayler.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Just want to make sure I'm visible and hearable.
Visible and hearable.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and talk about the value of the Boston Landmarks Commission. I am Greg Gayler, the Executive Director of the Boston Preservation Alliance, and I thank Chief Cook for the shout out earlier. We sent in a letter which I hope you've all had the opportunity to review, and I could speak on many of the questions raised today, but I'll keep myself to some prepared testimony to try to keep the time. For over 40 years, the Boston Preservation Alliance has worked to protect places, promote vibrancy, and preserve character here in Boston. We represent over 140 businesses and 30 organizations across the city and hundreds of individuals from every neighborhood. Historic resources and the unique character of each city neighborhood are central to Boston's success, to its appeal to tourists and businesses, and why so many are so proud Boston is their home. Icons like the Old State House to neighborhood spots like Wally's or Slade's or Doyle's or the St. James African Orthodox Church, they define and empower this city and our relationship to it. Boston wouldn't be the place we love, it wouldn't be as economically and socially successful without its historic places. But as you all know, with the success comes development pressure, teardowns, displacement, and the homogenization across neighborhoods, the loss of the connection to place that we all love. And I want to point out that despite common beliefs, historic preservation harmonizes well with affordability, it's environmentally beneficial, and advocates for thoughtful change and evolution, not stopping or freezing the city. Yet for a city that touts its history, the singular agency entrusted to oversee, guide, and plan the stewardship of our historic resource struggles. You heard it. It struggles to keep up with its regulatory requirements, for attention and influence, and it finds itself impossible to have the proactive role Boston needs and you're all calling for. Despite the cries of residents of the loss of historic places that matter to them, we haven't had a new historic district in 11 years. Places of value to Boston, such as the North End and Charlestown and Roxbury, have no cohesive protection. And as you've heard about the backlog, 77 or 80, depending on how you count, places considered important enough to protect and to be protected landmarks remain in a review backlog that's been there for decades. And despite recognition that our history and historic places should be equitable and reflect all our stories and the evolution of preservation that recognizes that, our surveys and assessments of historic places that truly set the groundwork for what is recognized and protected are antiquated and fail to represent that full history. If we all truly believe that these places matter as we say they do, the Boston Landmarks Commission budget must be enhanced, despite what staff has politely responded to your requests. As you noted, Chair, the Landmarks Commission budget is rolled up into the Environment Department and fairly opaque. But based on the limited information I've been able to extract, I recommend that the Landmarks Commission budget be increased by $350,000. That's merely 0.01% of the mayor's proposed 2021 operating budget. That would allow a modest bump in staff salaries to reduce the flight to other city agencies in nearby communities that you've mentioned, and it would provide 3 additional staff to allow the BLC to be more proactive, to get to work to address that backlog and survey deficiencies, to work with neighborhoods to better address their concerns and protect places that matter to them, and to work more collaboratively across City Hall. Despite what the city team said, they are woefully understaffed, and that's why they aren't doing many of the things you've asked. So finally, I just want to say, please remember that the Landmarks Commission isn't a nice to have, it's a must have. They have a regulatory role with legal responsibilities. In the last several years, they've reviewed over $1.5 billion worth of design review applications each year. The Landmarks Commission moves the city forward while guiding stewardship for future generations and needs financial support. And I'd happy to provide my perspective on any of the questions you raised earlier, if you like. Thank you very much for your time and your interest.
Thank you so much, Greg. Next up is Beth Harris, and then it'll be Sue Prindle, and then David Fixler. Beth, go ahead. Just have to unmute yourself.
Hi. My name is Dr. Beth Edwards Harris, and I'm an architectural historian and relatively new to the city after living here in the 70s and coming back and becoming more involved in preservation in the city. And I had prepared remarks, but Greg pretty much said it all, as did a number of the council people. So I just wanted to make 2 comments based on what I've heard from the meeting. And one is, I agree with Greg, there definitely needs to be more staff. There's just no way around. The backlogs can't be addressed with the ongoing staff in a reasonable fashion. And secondly, I also agree with some of the other council people that it would be good to look at this in a more strategic way and think outside the box. These study reports take a long time. Besides the money that it could take to outsource them, there's all kinds of issues that come up with that, such as neighborhoods that could afford to outsource them versus neighborhoods that may not be able to afford to outsource them. But there's ways to deal with that so that there's equity across neighborhoods to get these study reports completed, which allows the landmarkings to be completed and afford the buildings that are out there that need to be protected and also eligible for resources to help maintain them and fix them. And as somebody whose expertise is in 20th century architecture and thinking about this city, when we're looking at our underserved neighborhoods and communities, we really are going to be looking at a lot more buildings in volume of buildings that are not monumental, grandiose buildings, but are everyday buildings, you know, stores and restaurants and churches and schools that really speak the stories of our underserved neighborhoods and communities. And to get them through this process in a timely way, there just is going to have to be a different kind of outreach that the BLC just can't manage. I am so impressed with the amount of work that they do to do outreach. Well, not so much to be responsive when people call in and need help, but that takes so much time and so much effort. But the poorer the community and the less served the community, the more help that they need. And so I really see that it has to be more staff and then different ways of managing some of these internal regulatory things in perhaps a more creative way.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. Next up is Sue Prindle, and then it'll be David Fixler. Sue?
Thank you. I come from the sort of other side of the desk, being an advocate for a long time in the Back Bay. I moved in here in 1968. And I spoke to my neighborhood association about this lecture and this meeting, and they said that I really should come and specify that we really need the help as much as anyone. The commission was established in 1966, and in the 1980s under Mayor Flynn, I served for 8 years on the commission myself, so I know a little bit about how things work. I'm currently serving as co-chair of our association's architecture committee, which I've been doing for the last 15 years. And I interact with the staff on a regular basis every month, reviewing plans and preparing responses on various proposals. They are terrific. I so appreciate their knowledge and their dedication, and I don't mean any of this to be critical, but their workload is incredible, at least in our district. Last year, Frank, for just the Back Bay, they did 435 applications. 300 of these were dealt with administratively. But that review consumes almost as much staff time as a regular hearing. Plans have to be examined and revised, calls have to be made, site visits may be necessary. And in the more challenging cases, hearings need to be held and notifications sent out and decision letters written. And this is every month. That was 135 that they had major hearings on, some of them several times. So it's too much for one or two people to handle. And part of the difficulty is the turnover in staff. Somebody will get hired and they'll be there and they're off and running, and then someone will grab them from the private sector and off they go. And then you start over again. So it severely limits the time available to do any planning necessary. And you guys have talked about planning and how much we need it. And I couldn't agree more. The guidelines have to be informed. They have to be relevant. As the technology advances, we have to look at improvements such as car chargers and heating and air conditioning systems and solar panels. And none of this has been covered in any of the guidelines that I've seen. The needs of the business communities change constantly, and they require changes to signage and sometimes other building features. And these requests have to be looked at, and they have to be looked at in a coordinating fashion, which means planning, which means being able to step back from the 435 immediate applications and seeing how they fit into a larger context. In addition to creating them, the commission needs time and money to publicize and explain their policies and guidelines, and this has been brought up by a couple of the councilors. Frequently, violations occur because business owners or homeowners or city planners aren't aware of what the requirements of the districts are. Last year alone, the Back Bay Commission reviewed 41 such applications. Once the offense occurs, it's time-consuming and certainly expensive to correct, both for the city and for the owner, and this can and should be avoided. For these reasons, our association strongly supports increased funding for landmarks and the historic districts. Boston history is one of its most important assets, and I'm heartened to hear that so many of the participants today enjoy that, understand that to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And now I'm going to recognize David Fixler, and I just want to say to Allison and Kathy, who are both in the waiting room, that if either of you wants to testify, I'd appreciate it if you just raise your blue hand so that I know that. But David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. My name is David Fixler. I'm a practicing architect. I've been working in the city of Boston since the early 1980s. I've worked on many very historic buildings in all kinds of capacities, including the Christian Science Center, City Hall, the Lindemann and Hurley buildings, the State House, and Faneuil Hall. However, I'm speaking today both as a corporate member of the Boston Preservation Alliance and a longtime supporter of that organization as well, and as a representative of the Heritage Conservation Committee of the Society of Architectural Historians. And I felt it was particularly important to bring the SAH in because they are, of course, based in Chicago. They track historic preservation issues. We track historic preservation issues all over the globe. We feel that it is sufficiently important, really on a national level, to recognize the importance of what the Landmarks Commission does in Boston, to say this is something that really is of greater significance even than its immediate need to the city of Boston. So I'm just going to read a couple of things from the letter that we submitted. It's the blend of old and new that makes Boston an international destination, as well as a place valued by its residents. But we've also prioritized successful environmental and carbon neutral strategies that continue to seek ways to make historic fabric an important part of all kinds of building solutions for the future. Clearly, historic preservation has not only protected the most important of these resources, but demonstrated ways that the old and new can be creatively blended through continued use and creative adaptation. And of course, in order to do this, Boston relies upon a well-funded, highly trained historic preservation staff as provided by the DLC, with whom I've also had the pleasure of working over the last few decades. By continuing to fund the work of this organization, Boston can maintain its iconic nature and allow these dedicated individuals to identify creative ways that the new can build upon the old. And I just want to close by saying I was particularly taken by this discussion that you had during your debate about significance and the fact of whether or not something may be deemed significant, and to remind everyone that I also teach preservation and preservation theory, and the ways in which one may define significance can be broadly expanded. And I think that that's something that we see happening, and that Boston is taking a leadership and should continue to take a leadership role in to be as inclusive to all of the communities that we are representing as possible. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And I do want to recognize also Alison Frazee, who did raise her blue hand. So 1 second. Alison, I think you're in. Alison Frazee wanted to recognize you for public testimony.
Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to add that the Alliance, I want to reiterate that the Alliance is here. We have ideas about how to make improvements in many of the areas that come up. We work with partners all over the country on some of these same issues, so we know what's working in certain places or not, and we'd love to bring some of those successes here to Boston. We feel like Boston was at one time a leader in the preservation community, and we have fallen behind because of lack of resources for the Boston Landmarks Commission and a lack of priority for our historic resources. So we'd love to help work and find ways to make preservation a priority in the city again, and bring some different solutions that we don't currently have. And I'll just say one solution related to the budget that I think is crucial is hiring a staff person specifically for the backlog and making funds available to do that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And Kathy, I don't see you raising your blue hand. Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, missed that. So now, finally, I will, and this should be the last piece of public testimony, I'll recognize, once she gets in here. Sorry, everyone, for the technical, there we are. Kathy Kutaridis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the hearing today, Councillor Bach. This is really a long time coming, and it's really welcome. And it's just great to get the juices flowing and to get the ideas on the table, because this is an important function within City Hall, as all of the agencies who testified exhibited or the leadership. But it is important to underscore the fact that there are items related to staffing, salaries, and equitable pay between agencies and the professionals within those agencies, and also the support for historic resources within the city's economy, but also the city's sense of pride and sense of inclusion of everyone and their stories within the entire makeup of the city's understanding of itself. I guess that's the best way I can put it. But all of those things said, I guess I would put something forward because of the enthusiasm I'm hearing today across everything, both inside the council or amongst the membership, but also amongst the advocacy organizations and the bureaucracy, the folks who are actually doing this every day, and the representation at the cabinet level. And maybe it's time for a task force to take a look at historic preservation in the 21st century in this city, recognizing we're coming up on the 400th anniversary of the city, and we really should collectively, not just those of us in this room today, but also across the city, understand Boston's importance and the stories embodied in place in the city. And maybe it's time for us to come together and take a good look, not just at all the things we've talked about today, but benchmark against other cities, take a look at what the best practices are out there, and come up with a new agenda. We might be more creative than we think we can be right now. And that argument would include, should there be ways of funding landmarks that don't necessarily involve a strict city budget? That's a portion of it, but maybe there's some other ways of finding either other types of revenue, or if there's private resources or charitable resources that could go towards some of this, which would strengthen both the commission and the agencies, but also the agenda that we're really talking about today. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you again for convening a really important conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. And I just really want to thank all the advocates, and I want to thank again all the commissioners who do this work day in and day out, and all of the Landmarks Commission staff who do incredible work. And I mean, I think I said this earlier, but I think the sense of urgency that people feel around this really comes out of the fact that we all love the city's history. And we see that love embodied in the work of the Landmarks Commission, and we want to support it to be even more robust. So let me thank Roseanne Foley and thank Commissioner Spector and Chief Cook for joining us. I'm about to adjourn this hearing, and when I do, we have a 2 o'clock Parks hearing, which is going to start at 2:15, because if the chair doesn't eat lunch, it won't be a good hearing. But at 2:15 for my council colleagues, we will be definitively gaveling in for the Parks hearing. And thank you all again. With that, this meeting of the Boston City Council Ways and Means Committee is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks.
Thank you.